Welcome, everybody. I'll do introductions in a moment, but just let me say welcome. It's wonderful to be here in these magnificent surroundings of the Institut Français. But first of all, something quite special. This will be something of a mixed hour of discussion and various other things. I'd like to welcome the British-born Cypriot poet, Anthony Anaxagoru, to read some of his work on the theme of our discussion on crisis. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Cheers. I don't want to stand too close to everyone there, so I'm gonna stand on the corner here. I'm gonna read this poem that's entitled "A Guide to Living in the Apocalypse," that just responds to the theme. Does the door belong to the room, or does the room belong to the door? I'm at the threshold wearing my new shiny shoes. My socks, however, are secondhand, but there you go. What's beyond the door is critical mass, is hope in the shape of a worker. I keep my situation close to heart. I wear the future with all the panache of an angel oak tree. How else do we carry midnight? How else can we live beyond our homes? If there were a tragedy, we'd be somewhere close to the final act. Our hero down on his absolute luck, on his knees and pressure points. Speaking of which, does pressure find the pressurized first? Or here's an idea. I've been wearing this smile for years now, and all I've ever wanted is to be the happiest on my block. I can see so many opportunities. When the day finally stops to take off its boots, I'm planting my shadow in a cornfield for posterity. Call me before you leave. Chances are I'll be ready to.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And straight away, having that poem at the beginning raises a really interesting question, but maybe poetry tells us something different to science does about how we should live in an apocalypse. What sorts of knowledge, right, might help us make sense of this? This is an extremely ambitious panel entitled "The Guide to Living in the Apocalypse," but where we want to think through what a crisis means. Is a crisis some exceptional event that shakes us to the core, that disrupts some pre-existing normality, and after which, when it comes to an end, we recognize the end of it, we can return to something that we previously knew? Or is it something else? Is a crisis a moment that reveals patterns that have been underlying the normal life, or what we thought had been the normal life all along? And we're going to think of this in a broad range of contexts. Clearly, the pandemic is going to be at the top of our minds, but the climate crisis, a different, maybe more slowly moving, more glacially melting crisis, is something we can think about. We might think about the migrant crisis. We might even, although we swore to steer clear of it, think of the crisis of Europe and Brexit, or the crisis over Partygate, whatever we want. But crisis, how do we live in it? We have a fantastic panel put together for you this evening that has also been hit by crisis. So I am here, my name's Tim Beasley-Murray. I'm Associate Professor of European Thought and Culture at UCL. I do want to say en passant that it's a real privilege here to be here, as I have two of my UCL colleagues here, and this year the Institut Français have been kind enough to involve us in organizing things. So thank you to Matthias and Florence and the team for involving us in this exciting project. But we've been hit by crisis because Ute Steiger, another colleague, she has been hit by what is now the routine crisis of self-isolation. So there's a thing where we've become used to these sort of crises. And then the wonderful Merv Emre, who I was really looking forward to hear and meet, who's a star of the literary and intellectual world. She's a staff writer for New Yorker. She's a professor at Oxford. She's produced a brilliant book edition of Mrs. Dalloway recently. She unfortunately had a different sort of crisis on the playing ground of her children's school. So she's not here. So we wish her particularly, and also Ute, all the best with dealing with things there. But who do we have here? We have a number of things. And let me now again, I have to look because my computer has failed me. Well, first of all, exceptionally long password. I know, it's the UCL passwords. I'm going to have to do without that. So we have here, my memory will fail. I'll start with the person who I know best, which is Hélène Neveu-Kringelbach, who has stepped into Merv Emery's big shoes, but will fill them very well. Hélène is an anthropologist and an Africanist who has worked on dance in the past, but particularly works on migration, family migration from West Africa to Europe. And it's great that you've stepped in, and we will understand it's in a moment of crisis. On my left here is Jack Stilgo, who's Professor of Science and Technology Studies at UCL, and he works on technology, but particularly the governance and the politics of technology. And he has a project on driverless cars, right, which is a way in which we've introduced something that is automatic, but needs a political, a social, perhaps a legal framework. I'm sure he'll tell more about us more about that. Then we have on the screen represented only, not yet, Olivier, represented only by a film that he's produced, a very prominent Spanish philosopher, Daniel Inverarity, who's had all sorts of visiting professorships and so on, and he will set the tone. We're going to watch his film in 2 tranches, and we're going to respond to that. On this screen here, actually present, we have Olivier Rameau, who is a professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, likewise recipients of all sorts of honors. And the author most recently, a book a couple of years ago about voluntary solitude, which I think will be interesting when we talk about crisis as lockdown, crisis as confinement, as the French are saying, but also an intriguing book that will be published next year by Polity called How to Think Like an Iceberg. And we're hoping that Olivier will have some different perspectives, and he will be translated for at least in one direction by Karine, who is an experienced translator who's going to help us with that. Okay, so this basic question, we're gonna watch Daniel's film, and we're gonna set it up. You know, this sense of the temporality of crisis. How do we know what a crisis is? How do you know what it happens, and how does it relate to normality? So we're going to watch the first 3 minutes of Daniel on screen, and then I'm going to ask Olivier and Jack and Hélène, perhaps in that order, so we know that we're doing it in that order, to make some first remarks about what they're understanding from different disciplines. We have a philosopher, an anthropologist, someone who works in science and technology studies, what this word means and how we can make sense of it. So if we could have the first 3 minutes of the film, please.
A crisis is an acute and exceptional moment in which the survival of an organism or an institution is decided, and after which the sufferer dies out, the previous normality is restored, or the necessary transformations are carried out to guarantee survival. Some of the current catastrophes can be understood in this way, as just another crisis, which sooner or later will be resolved with vaccines, financial aid, and repairs. But there is another part that is not. There are dimensions of crisis that are not transitory or exceptional, and in relation to which it doesn't make sense to speak of a return to normality. The sociologist Bruno Latour expressed his good wishes by saying that he hoped we were only facing a crisis. Those who speak of crisis today seem to want to reassure themselves by mentioning a serious but passing event. The metaphor of the crisis alludes to an occasional glitch, implying that a stable and balanced society exists outside of that moment. But the reality is very different. The diagnoses that are made are full of questions and controversial aspects. There is no unanimity on solutions, and we cannot assume that we have the right instruments to deal with them. We should not delude ourselves into thinking that we only lack decisiveness and political will. Even if we know where we need to go, it is not entirely clear how the transition is made, whether we have the right instruments, who bears the costs, which interests and values should weigh most heavily on the balance sheet. The solutions are about changing the way we live, but what the formula is for doing so is not obvious and is outside the usual logic of our institutions, which were designed to do other, much simple things. We are not in the midst of a crisis, or even of several crises, as is often said, for example, by the term syndemic. We don't live in a society in which there are contagions, but in a contagious society. We are in an epidemic world and not so much in a world in which epidemics break out from time to time, of systemic financial instability rather than of occasional economic crisis.
Okay, so that's the first part of Daniel's reflections. Let's pick up on that and ask maybe Olivier, first of all, what about this idea that the crisis is not this glitch, that society is not one where contagions break out, but it's a contagious society. It's about systemic financial instability, to take the financial crisis, rather than occasional moments where the system appears not to work. Olivier.
Bonsoir déjà à toutes et à tous. Merci de l'invitation. Je crois que sur la notion de crise, il est important de se rappeler son étymologie. C'est une étymologie. L'étymologie est précise. Elle donne par exemple les mots suivants. La crise renvoie au verbe séparer, au verbe choisir, au verbe discerner, mais aussi au verbe se battre, se mesurer aux autres. Pourquoi je dis ça? Parce que, par exemple, dans le monde grec, la notion de crise, on la mobilise lorsqu'on veut décrire la fin d'un combat militaire. Et à ce moment-là, la notion de crise désigne une décision.
So the etymology is precise. When we talk about crisis, we think about various verbs. We think about separation, we think about choosing, we think about discerning, we think about fighting. And in Greek, the Greek version of crisis means that when there's a crisis, you have to mobilize. And it also describes the end of a military fight.
Pourquoi je dis ça? Pour une raison très simple, c'est que il y a une compréhension moderne qui est très différente de la notion de crise. Elle vient d'une expérience du temps qui, par exemple, a été très bien thématisée par l'historien allemand Reinhard Koselleck, et il nous explique assez simplement la chose suivante, c'est que les modernes se sont sentis à un moment incapables de pouvoir tirer des modèles du passé pour envisager le futur.
So why do I say this? I say this very simply because when you think about it and you think about how Reinhard Koselleck described this, he felt that people who were contemporary, modernists, felt that they couldn't draw on the lessons of the past in order to learn about the future.
Et c'est de là que vient notre compréhension de la notion de crise qu'on rapporte à un présent sans fin, comme un état d'indécision, de désordre, d'incertitude, dans lequel plus personne n'arrive à s'orienter.
And it's from that comes our interpretation of crisis. In other words, a state in which we're indecisive, we can't make decisions, it's a state of disorder and uncertainty.
Alors, je tenais à préciser ces deux expériences, en fait, de la crise, parce que ça nous permet, je crois, de ne pas utiliser cette notion de manière indifférenciée. Je crois que ça nous permet de comprendre, par exemple, que le concept de crise interminable, de crise généralisée, de crise qui en fait n'a aucun contour, ni commencement, ni fin, est assez impensable. Il est invivable, insupportable, mais il est aussi assez impensable aujourd'hui.
So I think today, when you think about this concept of crisis, which is potentially a never-ending crisis, a general crisis, which has no beginning or end, it's something that we can't, in a way, bear thinking about today.
Alors, permettez-moi juste de terminer peut-être cette première mise en route. Je crois que dès lors, il faut arriver à ne pas parler de crise à propos de tout. Et il est évident que lorsqu'on utilise aujourd'hui, par exemple, la formule de crise civilisationnelle, on sent l'effet de rhétorique idéologique. Lorsqu'en revanche, on utilise l'expression de crise climatique, c'est bien pour désigner autre chose, c'est-à-dire un état d'urgence. Et à ce moment-là.
Allow me to finish the first part. We must not associate crisis with absolutely everything. We can talk about crisis within civilization, but we can also, when we're talking about crisis as far as climate change is concerned, there we're talking about urgency.
Thank you, Olivier. And I think it's really useful the way in which you brought us two things straight away, an understanding of the temporal dimension, but also perhaps returning crisis to its roots. And you suggested that there's a contrast between a Greek understanding of crisis as a moment of decision, is root in the verb to judge, right? Kritein, to judge, and our modern understanding of crisis, which is a time when we can't decide, of indecisiveness. But I wonder, and I want to come to Hélène, actually, I'm jumping the order here, whether actually it depends who you are. There's still a moment of judge. Who judges what is a crisis? That's still there. You know, when is a crisis for whom? And why did maybe people experience crisis differently? And Hélène, could I come perhaps to you now?
Yes, thank you, Tim. To me, as an anthropologist, it always makes very good sense to ask who are we actually when we talk about we are in crisis. Very often, the way in which crisis is represented in the public space in Europe is from a very Eurocentric perspective. We are in a crisis because we can't sustain life, a state of normality as we normally like to have it, but other people's crises do not appear as important or as urgent, perhaps. And I think it's very important to try to reverse the gaze from time to time and ask, whose crisis is it when we talk about a crisis of migration, for example? I do field work in parts of West Africa, Francophone West Africa, where people don't become migrants. They're not mobile because they can't do anything else necessarily, but it may be, for example, part of entire communities or entire families' strategies to build resilience over longer periods of time so that risk may be averted. In those societies, migration isn't a crisis, mobility isn't a crisis. It's part of a diversification of livelihoods. And also, of course, at an individual level, people like everybody everywhere else want to see the world and go on adventures. But there is a broader sense in which resilience for entire communities mean that some people have to leave and go elsewhere to earn a living. And that way you diversify your options and you build this resilience that will allow you to face what is essentially the vulnerability of everyday life. It's not that people go necessarily away when they're in a crisis, although this may happen for when people are faced with environmental degradation, for example. So what is a crisis seen from Europe can be a strategy to actually avert crises in other contexts. What people consider to be crisis in those contexts can be precisely losing the ability to build this resilience over longer periods of time, so that if you can't achieve mobility, if some of your family members can no longer go to other parts of the continent or travel to Europe, for example, to support the rest of the family, it is that which is the crisis. The crisis may also be a breakdown in social relations, because building resilience is about social relations. It's about multiplying that networks you can mobilize in times of hardship, for example. So this notion of crisis for us is very important to relativize and put in a more global perspective, perhaps, because it's actually looking at things in a more global perspective that will enable us to rethink what we need to do to build our global resilience when it comes to climate, for example, when it comes to perhaps developing different economic models. So that's what I wanted to start with. You know, whose crisis are we actually talking about? Whose perspective are we talking about?
Thank you very much, Hélène. And it's a really interesting idea that we'll come to maybe later as well. The notion it might be a privilege to think of ourselves as being in crisis. It's, you know, it's the midlife crisis is normally men who indulge themselves in a midlife crisis, whereas women have midlife crisis. Oh, well, that's just a sorry story of middle age, right? And maybe it's a Western drama that we play with ourselves. And maybe what you mentioned, Olivier, the interminable unbearableness of existence is actually the stuff that we're shielded from that by privilege. I think it's very interesting. Jack, can I come to you maybe to talk about this notion of, you know, permanent crisis, and does that mean something? And maybe if you could, you know, give us your angle on some of the things we've been addressing.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I particularly appreciate the midlife crisis, the segue to the other middle-aged man on the stage. But so a couple of things that really came out of Olivier's contribution as well was, so as somebody that's interested in studying the place of science and technology in society, I guess one of the things that's come to mind just sitting up here is the question of how crises become knowable. And, you know, with both a pandemic and climate change, two examples that have already come up, they are both in the 21st century obviously knowable through an extraordinarily complex and well-tuned apparatus of science, which has interesting implications for how we think about the politics of crisis, because, you know, there has been a lot of talk certainly in Britain, that when it came to COVID, we were all in this together. But as Hélène has made very clear, you know, the we there is not at all well defined, and actually it's the job of maybe a successful polity to define and shape that we, and to build the sense of solidarity that makes that sort of response possible. And it strikes me that with something like COVID, our actual experience of it is much more through the response to the pandemic than to, you know, the scientific reality of you know, this thing encompassing us all, and that solidarity has actually gone rather better than government were at first expecting that it would. You know, they expected that we would be rather less well behaved than we turned out to be. But it's become very clear that a pandemic, you know, this supposedly global problem has thrown into very stark relief some of the inequalities, even within a rich country like Britain. It was characterized by somebody as, you know, the experience of the pandemic was rich people sitting at home while poor people brought them things, right? It was that sort of, you know, we sort of talked about the pandemic and our experience of working from home without having to think very much about what was going on, including, you know, the invisibility of death, which is something that I think we should have found more shocking than we did, right? We're approaching sort of 18 million global deaths, and yet somehow we have no way really to make sense of that number. I was struck by, so I was looking at something that the philosopher Benjamin Bratton has written. He brought out a book last year, which was all about how, you know, pandemics and climate change, these sort of crises, are a sort of revenge of the real, that they're, you know, for all of our our decadence, these things become inescapable, right? That the natural world will bite back. But there is a danger, I think, if we take that sort of view, that we miss some of the politics of it, which might really it may really harm our political responses to it. And maybe we'll get onto this later in terms of what sorts of responses might be mobilized to not just the pandemics in terms of technology or political movements or social movements, but also to things like climate change, which, you know, unlike a pandemic, is not going anywhere, right? There is still, you know, this hope, if you're a politician thinking about the pandemic, that it's an acute crisis, that especially if you're a conservative, small c conservative government, you know, no matter what your brand, you're thinking we can get back to normal, right? And we might have various routes back to normal, but to go to the temporality of it, right? In climate change, there is no route back. There's only ways forward, and those ways forward will be much more bitterly contested than they are even today.
Thank you, Jack. I think let's just pick on one thing that's come through in different ways, but that, and I want to speak, we've got science and technology, we've got a philosopher, we've got an anthropologist. I'll speak as a literary scholar for a moment, that crisis may be that moment where we realize how badly things have been going all along. So if we set it in a sort of literary shape, it's a moment of anagnorisis, that moment in tragedy where the hero realizes all the flaws that he had all along. And then it's what we do with it. Do we put out our eyes? Or can we, you know, say, right, well, there isn't any going back, but it's a moment of knowledge. We realize this thing that maybe is everyday life for everybody else, but actually we see it's not. It's this structural thing that has been getting worse and worse. It's this moment of knowledge. I do want to talk, I know this is a ridiculously swift move through the big questions of the day, but about solutions for a moment. And Daniel, in the second part of his video, has some quite interesting ideas. And one I'll point it out to you. You know, it's, on the film, it's a little bit difficult to hear. But normally if there's a problem, then the people who have to solve the problem are different from the people who cause it. Whereas the worrying thing about many of the crises that we face here, and definitely the climate one, is it's the same people who cause the problem who we're going to rely on to solve it. That might be science or financial institutions or whatever it is. And how do we deal with that? So let's watch the next bit of Daniel's film, and then we'll address some of these questions about agency, utility, solutions, and so on. Yeah.
Society is in a state of permanent crisis. It doesn't mean that there are many crises, but that there is no outside world from which this crisis will reach us, and that we are unlikely to be capable of anything that would properly qualify as their solution. This is best demonstrated by the fact that we don't know how and when crises end. We human beings argue a lot about the nature of the crisis in which we find ourselves. But it is harder for us to agree on the normality to which we should aspire, whether it consists of what is after the shock, whether it is a recovery of the moment before the crisis, or whether it involves transformative changes. It is not a matter of meteors falling from space, but of crises that we produce with practices and institutions that should be used to solve them. This coincidence between those who originate such crises and those who should solve them is the real problem when it comes to dealing with them. It does little to address the situation if reassuring interpretation of crises are understood as temporary exceptional situations, moments of change or turning points, as if financial instability, climate change, pandemics, or political crises were things that happen and end, without considering that they are rather phenomena that reveal various structural problems in our social practices. One can present oneself as an indignant intellectual, a militant environmentalist, or even as the Queen of England, who says she is concerned that there is a lot of talk and nothing is being done. all these are gestures and speeches that can make us lose sight of the fact that we are dealing with a highly complex and to some extent unmanageable phenomenon. Criticism is very necessary, but it is more effective when it is carried out taking into account the reasons why people and societies are reluctant to change. What institutional weaknesses are evident in appeals that do not end up changing the habits that lead us to such crises and situations? Why we humans hardly change when we know what we should do, but nothing else, even if that knowledge offers irrefutable data that we are heading towards catastrophe.
Okay, so that's the second and final part of Daniel's reflection. And I think we'll go in reverse order here. I want maybe Jack to come in on this question of technological solutions and how we do that. Maybe, Hélène, you could pick up on some of the things we're talking about a global and non-Eurocentric context for this. And Olivier, finally, afterwards, maybe you could talk about these questions of novelty, this l'épreuve de la nouveauté I understand you've been thinking about. We should bear in mind we have about 20 minutes of this discussion left, so we should try and be snappy.
I'll try and be snappy. So I'm not sure if Olivier was hinting to, but some of you will have seen the Netflix movie "Don't Look Up," right? Which sort of was really annoying for me, and would have been annoying for some of you in the crowd, because it presented the crisis as, this external thing and the problem was people's willful ignorance of this external thing, and as Daniel was describing, it was the crises are of our own making, right? He mentions the risk society, Ulrich Beck's hugely influential idea, to capture the late modern condition. And the risk society raises a serious question of responsibility. What in more wonkish circles are sometimes, crises are reframed as wicked problems, where the agents of the solution are also the same as the agents of the problem. There's no way of stepping outside the problem in order to assess it, and in seeking to solve it, you may make things worse, or at least not know if you're making any things better. So that's a sort of fundamental governance challenge, and the sort of the tangle that we find ourselves in with those crises means that the incentives to reach for something else are enormous. And the thing that I'm particularly interested in is what I guess we could characterize as technological fixes, which are, if you take climate change, they're ways that we might be able to subvert or leapfrog, whatever your favorite metaphor is, all of the messy business of climate negotiation and behavior change, and instead just seek a way that we can find some sort of technological sticking plaster that, yes, it might treat the symptoms rather than the causes, but we've been rubbish at treating the causes, so maybe it's our only hope. And I've been very interested in the weird world of geoengineering, the sort of sci-fi attempt to come up with, or not to come up with, just to imagine the possibility of technological ways out of the climate crisis, and in a sense, that's very old 1950s techno optimism coming through, and it's sort of relatively easy to laugh some of that off, but occasionally it gets taken seriously within climate politics. But we see echoes of it in the discussion about artificial intelligence at the moment. I mean, my own work is on self-driving cars at the moment, and if you talk to the people developing self-driving cars, they would say we have this crisis, which is that more than 1 million people get killed by cars every year. It's an extraordinary number. Again, one of these sort of invisible, J.G. Ballard actually called it a pandemic cataclysm in the introduction to Crash, but one of these things that we just ignore because it's a fact of 20th century life. And the self-driving car people will say, well, we'll fix that, right? That's a human frailty that can just be sorted out by AI, and it's a very seductive argument. It's also rather easy to push back against, but it is, you know, it is a forceful one. When it comes to the pandemic, you know, technological fixes actually were initially more successful than anybody dared hope. Right? The idea of a vaccine within a year of finding the genome for the virus that you're trying to vaccinate against was seen as absolutely magical. Right? A vaccine had never been developed even 5 times, 10 times that quickly, and yet now we know that the vaccine was not such a clean technological fix. It was actually rather messy, which is something that we always realize about these technological fixes, that ultimately, you know, you cannot escape politics, no matter how much Elon Musk and his friends would like us to be able to.
Thank you, Jack. Hélène.
Those are really big questions, and I wish I had some fantastic solutions to offer. But I was just thinking about picking up on what Jack just said about how ultimately all solutions need to be in some sense political. I totally agree with this. I think just doom and gloom about the future can be very disabling. If, on the other hand, we empower artists, younger people, communities in the global south who've managed to endure and who've worked on their resilience for many generations, if we empower them to think perhaps about how we may have economic and political systems which aren't so focused on the short term, how we may have institutions led by people who don't need to worry about being re-elected every few years, if we could rethink our economic global order outside of a development industry that is working through projects that need to be refunded every few years, for example, then we may find solutions that will take us away from the idea of growth, from a capitalist model, which is essentially short-term, short-sighted, and which has brought us where we are in the first place. But in order to do that, we need to empower categories of people we never actually hear from. Younger people, people who are not normally at the table. Because I think Daniel is absolutely right in his video that we can't expect those same institutions that have brought crisis in the first place to be able to solve them. And all these institutions are under a very short temporality. They are structurally organized to function in a very short-term basis. And we tend to think in a much more short-term way, perhaps, than people did in the past. But I do think there are alternatives to that. And I personally think we need to involve artists from various parts of the world into the conversation, because there is a lack of imagination in terms of how we may rethink our political and economic system. And I think young people and artists have quite a lot to say about that, whether it's through film or whether it's, you know, even the creativity that is involved in technology, in developing technological solutions, for example, that could be said to be a form of art. So we need a different kind of thinking. And to simply talk about catastrophe is actually very disabling. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hélène. And Olivier.
C'est passionnant. Ce qui me gêne avec le concept de crise généralisée, c'est qu'il nous fait oublier le processus d'apprentissage qu'il y a dans toute crise.
Well, it's fascinating. It's fascinating, but what bothers me about a generalized crisis is that people seem to forget that there's a kind of period of apprenticeship before any crisis.
Mais avec la multiplication des crises que nous vivons, ce processus d'apprentissage est compliqué, et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous oscillons sans cesse entre un état d'effroi devant certaines crises, et puis parfois, lorsqu'on s'aperçoit que l'on parvient à sortir d'une crise, un état d'enthousiasme, une espèce de tonique subie.
So
C'est
with the
pour ça.
with the multiplicity of crises that we're living through, the period of apprenticeship is more complicated. And sometimes there's some crises where we really feel that we're in a state of horror. We're absolutely horrified by it. But there are other crises where we feel when we can overcome them, that we feel a certain amount of enthusiasm.
C'est pour ça, je crois qu'il est assez souvent difficile de trouver des solutions en peu de temps, et surtout qui ne dépendraient que d'un groupe de personnes, par exemple. C'est ce qui est décrit par la philosophe Donna Haraway avec la notion de trouble. En fait, nous sommes troublés, c'est-à-dire que nous n'arrivons jamais, ou plutôt nous oscillons toujours d'un état qui nous paralyse, qui nous bloque, à un autre état qui nous donne envie d'agir. Et pour trouver des solutions, il faudrait que nous puissions, en quelque sorte, actionner le second levier, celui qui nous donne toujours envie d'agir. Et pour finir, je dirais que là, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ce qui vient d'être dit. L'imagination est un gouvernail sublime pour l'action. Et je crois qu'on va en parler sans doute plus tard. C'est pour cette raison qu'il faut faire confiance à tous les nouveaux personnages qui pourraient arriver sur la scène aujourd'hui, la scène du monde, et notamment, puisque nous avons déjà parlé de la crise climatique, tous les non-humains qui font partie également de notre vie quotidienne. Nous avons entendu plus nettement les chants d'oiseaux, rappelez-vous, durant le confinement.
So that's why it's quite difficult to find solutions, to find a solution in very little time. And often it can lead, the fact that the solution can't be found very quickly, it can lead to depression. Nahave, the philosopher, talked about being troubled and how one oscillates when one's troubled, and that can lead to a certain paralysis. But there are certain solutions which allow us, which make us decide we want to act. And so I think that that's the lever that we have to use, not the lever of paralysis. We've got to really be able to respond. And to respond or to act is really the most sublime kind of imaginary rudder. Vous pouvez répéter la fin?
La fin, c'est simplement cette idée que l'imagination qui a déjà été évoquée, nous permettrait de nous rendre plus attentifs à tous les nouveaux personnages qui arrivent ou que nous pouvons faire surgir dans nos histoires, sur la scène du monde. Et là, je pense aux non-humains auxquels nous prêtons plus de regard aujourd'hui avec la crise climatique. Et je prenais l'exemple très, très connu de tous aujourd'hui, durant la condition de confinement, où nous avons subitement réentendu le chant des oiseaux de manière plus nette. En fait, les oiseaux ont décidé, au sens ancien du terme crise, de se remettre à chanter, profitant de l'occasion qui leur était donnée.
And so imagination allows us to be more aware of of everything that's new. And as far as climate change is concerned, suddenly we're able to be far more aware of non-humans. The crisis in lockdown suddenly meant that we could certainly hear birds singing again. And so birds decided to sing during this crisis.
Thank you, Olivier. I think that's a beautiful image, that the birds manifest crisis by deciding to make themselves audible to us again. And you know, I think what we're getting to is what I wanted, just a final point in a ridiculously short amount of time, to think about. I know we said before that maybe it's a privilege to enjoy a crisis. You know, it's like people who had a good war, you know, the Second World War, that man who profited out of it or something. But what are these things? These things that we can find in the crisis that we've experienced. Bruno Latour, who's very much, you know, Banquo's ghost at this particular feast, suggested that the metaphysics of confinement and deconfinement might provide opportunity for metamorphosis. What can can we think about here? We know we've never been in it all together, but are there new forms of solidarity that we've forced to, through certain shared experiences, that we've been able to discover? So that's, I guess, my question for all three of you in about 30 seconds, right? What form of metamorphosis do you think, are positives that we can take out of this? How can we help the birds to decide to sing for us again, or whatever it might be? Which way should we go? Olivier, you first, and then we'll go back round.
En 30 secondes, difficile, mais peut-être qu'on peut s'inventer ou se réinventer une vie intérieure.
Un instant, maybe a little bit more than 30 seconds. We've been given some more time.
Ok. À propos du confinement, je pense à ce que Jack a dit, comment le confinement nous est apparu, la façon dont on l'a connu, c'est la surprise. Ça a été très, très rapide comme décision politique. Et donc, à ce moment...
In 30 seconds, it's a bit difficult, but maybe what we can do is we can, as far as lockdown is concerned, just as Jack said, it's something that suddenly did happen and it was quite difficult to deal with initially.
Et le confinement, on le sait, a été un révélateur d'inégalités assez frappant. Donc, tout dépend de la façon dont chacun et chacune a vécu cet isolement. Soit il était lui-même tout seul, et à ce moment-là, il s'est probablement senti encore plus seul, soit il était avec d'autres personnes. Cet isolement de groupe a pu être vécu bien, comme pas bien du tout. Tout dépend des conditions d'habitation. C'est un problème qu'il faut approcher de manière très, très concrète.
So I think lockdown is something that's got to be dealt with in a very concrete fashion. It certainly reveals that there are a number of inequalities, and there are some people who possibly lived through lockdown isolated and they were alone, and so they felt even more alone. But there are other people who've lived through their lockdown or their isolation in a group, and their experience of lockdown, of course, depended on the way in which on their housing, the way in which they were living.
Mais imaginons que les situations concrètes de chacune et de chacun étaient suffisamment satisfaisantes pour développer ce que j'appellerais une vie intérieure. Et je reviens au bénéfice de l'imagination. Disons-le autrement, à ce que la littérature peut apporter. On se raconte des histoires, on en découvre d'autres. Et à ce moment-là, une fois de plus, de nouveaux personnages arrivent sur la scène. Et je crois que c'est ça que l'on peut mettre à profit, découvrir, et qui a pu se passer dans le confinement aussi.
But let us think about imagination. Let us think about developing an internal life, imagination. I think that that's something that we can think about. For example, literature is telling us stories. It's introducing us to new characters, new personalities. And I think that that's something that could be considered to be positive.
Thank you, Olivier. And I appreciate the emphasis in our discussion on different forms of imagination. I think there's an important case being made here. Hélène.
I'm not sure about alternative forms of solidarity. There's plenty we could think about, but one thing that really struck me in the last couple of years is the shared humanity that came to the fore in the pain we all went through when we realized how many people are actually dying alone. And I think there is perhaps something to think about very carefully in how we treat death, how we treat old age. There is a very good reason why in many traditional societies, people put a lot of emphasis on intergenerational transmission, put a lot of emphasis on listening to the life stories of older people, how this is treated as a way of learning about life by younger people, for example. And we tend to forget these things, but we've realized during COVID how much we've missed out on by being isolated. from people who are dying on their own in hospitals, in care homes, for example. So if we can think of ways of repairing time, ways for different generations to spend more time together, I think we'll really have learned something important. And the other thing, of course, is the importance of ritual linked to death. Think about the pain most people have gone through not being able to attend someone's funeral, for example. I've certainly experienced that. I think many of us have. We've realized that ritual plays a very important role in our lives. Ritual has a way of bringing us together, but also to repair the damage done by all the things life throws at us. And I do think ritual would be an important part of building this resilience that we need to think about for the future. So let's perhaps think about ways in which we can recreate rituals to be together, not online, but actually together, but perhaps also virtually. So it's not exactly new forms of solidarity, but I do think there is an opportunity to rethink new ways of being together. And I do think ritual should play quite a central role in that, perhaps even inventing new rituals to be together across generations, for example.
Thank you, Ellen. We don't want to be too ephemerally political, but I think, the behavior of the current British government, the reasons why it has disgusted people so much is some of these things that were hard won in the pandemic, this encounter with death, this ethic of care that people had to develop, the sense of rituals, the sense of sacrifice, all these things, right, which were some of these new forms of being and not being with other people that, which is what the vast majority of the people had to adopt and learn how to do. I think, that's why it's so deeply resonant, the things that we're looking at in our papers in the last few weeks. Jack, last word for you. We will have time for some questions. I do hope that we'll be able to open up things very briefly.
Thanks, Tim. And Ellen, I think that's so. I think ritual is a really interesting way into it, because if a crisis as a disruption is the opportunity to rethink some of those habits and behaviors that we've got locked into that we might suddenly realize are destructive or pointless. And a sort of prosaic example, but maybe a very consequential one, is the realization that 10 business trips a day on planes just suddenly, we just can't justify the carbon cost or the actual cost or the time away from our families or all the rest of it. And we just think, maybe that's a moment where, as privileged people, we think, why were we doing that anyway? But I'm conscious that those sorts of the realizations of those disruptions require an extraordinary privilege. And I'm conscious of the line. Was it Anthony, the poet? Was that his name? Yes. So one of his lines where he was talking about how, maybe pressure finds the pressurized first. And I thought that was a really nice way of, capturing the extraordinary unevenness with which crises are felt. And I think, we just can't get away from the inequalities revealed through the COVID pandemic. I mean, one of the odd things I did during lockdown was go and hang out with some conspiracy theorists, because I thought, well, they're the only people that are gathering because they're the only people mad enough to break the rules. So I'll go down to Trafalgar Square and hang out with them. And so I was interested. A lot of people in universities would say, how can they believe these things? How can they be wrong about so many things? And the response might be to sort of correct that information. But I was interested in, what are these people afraid of? And it strikes me that one of the things that they are afraid of is precisely the sort of talk that we're engaged in now, which is talk about discovering what they call the new normal, right? And they use the language of the World Economic Forum, who talk about the Great Reset, and they built these elaborate conspiracy theories around this, right? Because they are very scared that people in positions of power will use this crisis as a way to to concentrate their power, to change the world in ways that they are scared of, and that they feel they're going to be even more disempowered by. And you know, viewed in that way, that becomes a political response rather than conspiracy theory madness. But I think it's quite a nice way to understand climate change denial as well, right? Which, rather than being a scientific miscalculation, is a concern about climate change being used as a justification for major societal revolution that may not be in the interests of everybody. And I think, you know, people have have a right to be scared of revolution, because people get hurt by revolutions. Where does that take us? I was sort of hoping that would be optimistic, but it's ended up rather pessimistic. Sorry about that.
Well, you did wonderfully, because you brought us back to Anthony at the beginning, and one should always end with a return to the beginning. So it's almost as if we'd planned it. Thank you very much, Jack and Hélène and Olivier and Karine and also Daniel, who was on video. We probably have about a very short time if anyone has some burning question. Otherwise, you can grab us afterwards and chat elsewhere in the building.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'll be very quick. So my question is our society, do you believe our society is becoming more and more risk adverse because we are afraid of crisis? Because the reason we see it as something that disrupts our habits, and we want to avoid that.
Okay, well, maybe one or two more so we can deal with them. So about risk and whether we become more risk averse. Anyone else? Oh, well, goodness, that does help for timekeeping. Either of you have on risk. I always think I'm working actually on games and risk at the moment. And people always say that, oh, he or she has got nothing to lose. So if you have nothing, then you'll be really risk prone. Whereas once again, it's about privilege. People have loads of stuff. They can afford to gamble, you know, and then you put a tenner on the horses if you're earning loads, right? It doesn't matter. In fact, risk is a matter of privilege. And yet it's also what keeps us alive as human beings, right? So I'm very conflicted about risk, but I think it does bring us back to who can afford to risk things, right?
Can I just add one thing to that? I think it's a really interesting question. And to return to Ulrich Beck, who you know, who Daniel mentioned earlier. So I think Ulrich Beck would say that yes, we are, I mean, becoming more risk averse in part because we have sort of constructed all of these mechanisms that give us at least the illusion that we're in control of all of the risks that might affect us. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about a pandemic, is that it challenges our view of ourselves so deeply. And I think particularly this pandemic, particularly when a pandemic like this could arrive in a country like the UK, which probably, you know, for its weight, has the best biomedical apparatus of anywhere in the world, and yet was proven pretty rubbish at dealing with it. Right? I mean, you can talk about, you know, the Oxford vaccine and all the rest of it, but there was, you know, an elaborate system in which we convinced ourselves that this sort of thing wasn't a worry anymore, that we had consigned these risks to the past, just as we'd consigned the risks of being attacked by wild animals and getting our houses blown over by tornadoes. Right? I mean, I think risk aversion, you know, and with the financial crisis, right? I mean, the financial crisis was in part a product of this illusion of control, that we thought that we had controlled as an economy financial risk. And then when that was found not to be the case, the speed with which the financial system closed around it to protect itself rather than to address the wider crisis, I think is a rather depressing lesson.
I think we're going to have to let Jack have the final word. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and being patient and listening to things from poetry to film and so on. But above all, I want to thank Olivier that was wonderful to have you in French from Paris, I think. Karine, thank you for helping out with that too. Jack, it was great that we actually hadn't met before this evening, so I was really interested to hear a colleague talk about that. Hélène, thank you so much for stepping in and giving us, I think, what was a really valuable perspective on things, and also to Daniel for his film. And thanks to the Institut Français for making this possible. Thank you, everybody.